All right, good afternoon. Well, I'm glad for the last presentation because I had heard previously we talked a little bit about stormwater, about natural hazards and those things. Then we kind of shifted to energy. And I'm going to go back actually to natural hazards and in particular flooding because that's the lens which me and my organization seems to looks at a lot of these types of issues. My name is Chad Berginnis. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'm really excited to be here. But in the floodplain management world, and maybe these are some lessons learned, at least I'd like to think so, is that we've been in this resiliency mode and in this trying to reduce losses and the impacts on those for actually quite a long time. This is a picture of Dr. Gilbert White, the late Dr. White, passed away a few years ago. But even as early as the 1940s, he was talking about some different ways to manage flood issues. Now, if you've ever been focusing on the issue of flooding in the United States, for about 200 years prior to that, our sole way of dealing with floods is build a big levee, control the water. We can control it, we will control it. And Gilbert said, even in the 1940s, that isn't the way we do it. And so it wasn't until the late 1960s that we ushered in a whole an era of non-structural flood management. But as ASFPM, we are a national organization. We have a dual-purpose mission. And the first one says mitigate losses and costs and impacts of flooding. Now, when I use the term mitigate, and this is probably one of the areas as folks in the news industry work with this, I use the word mitigate in a different way that you've heard mitigate most of the day today. And I use it from the standpoint of hazard mitigation. Usually the term mitigate in the climate change dialogue is something to do with sequestration of CO2. Hazard mitigation tend to be long-term measures to reduce risk from these natural hazards when they occur in the future. But then the other part of our mission is also protecting and enhancing natural functions of floodplains. So by our very mission, we're an organization that absolutely plugs into this issue of resiliency and of climate change. And really a lot of our members as an organization are those that are dealing with adaptation. I have local floodplain managers in Norfolk, Virginia, down near Miami, that are dealing with climate. It's a tangible thing to them. They are dealing with subdivision roads that flood during high tide. So when we talk about sea level rise, this is not a theoretical issue. This is something that is happening and occurring right now. So these are a couple of the different activities that we're involved in as an organization. But I want to set up the national view by talking a little bit, and I know there was an earlier panel on local and state approaches, but as we ramp up, trying to show a bit of this hierarchy and where there are opportunities, whether it's at the local, at the state, or perhaps at the national level. And our first place that we're going to stop is Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And in Pawleys Island, if you're familiar with the geography, of course, sitting right there on the coast, and we have a new national climate assessment that talks about sea level rise in different parts of the country, and a lot of the coastal and island communities are having to deal with that. So in the flood business, one of the things that we do is we deal with the National Flood Insurance Program, and for a community to participate in the NFIP, they must adopt local land use regulations. So this is kind of a unique incentive-based program that the federal government makes available flood insurance in exchange for communities adopting these standards. The minimum standards haven't been updated in 30 years. And so as, of course, what has happened in the last 30 years, we've learned a whole lot more about our climate. We know that climate change is happening. We know that sea level rise is happening, and yet the federal standards stay the same. And that'll be one of the lessons I'll come back to when we talk about scaling up nationally. So what we're seeing is a lot of local and state leadership in dealing with climate change and resiliency, especially as it deals with flooding. So in Pawleys Island, one of the things they did this past summer is they are debating within their council to have a minimum building elevation 3 feet higher than what the NFIP minimum standard is. So, you know, it used to be, I've been in this business for over 20 years now, and I used to encourage communities to say, you know what, good job if you can go 1 foot above. And you usually have, it's a bruising fight between your council and building industry and everybody else. And in Pawleys Island, they're talking 3 feet. And what was fascinating about this story, and I called the floodplain manager after that, I looked up, I was like, oh, he's a member, so if he wasn't, I was going to encourage him to join. But was talking to him a little bit, and what he said is, he said, you know, we got some good information and good data from the national level that I was able to use to talk to my council and convince them that this is the right thing to do. And in fact, in the news story, and this is one of those great stories that was written up, there were no objections. During the public hearing, nobody objected to this. So I kind of see this, I think there was an earlier question, you know, in other parts of the country, how is this resonating at the local level? This is South Carolina. So you know, at least in some areas, it is starting to be dealt with. Now, closer to this area, we have South Holland, Illinois. And what I like about the South Holland story is South Holland's a fairly small community, about 21,000 people, I believe, and in the greater Chicagoland area here. But South Holland has been dealing with flood issues for a long time. And I get, when I present to our chapters around the country, you know, I talk to a lot of small and rural communities that say, well, geez, you know, what can we do as a small community? Well, you know, South Holland, for a few decades now, has been running a flood hazard mitigation rebate program, up to $2,500 per household to do hazard mitigation. I know there was another question in terms about, you know, earlier about costs and some of those kinds of things to doing these types of adaptation. And hazard mitigation and adaptation really are simultaneous in my world in dealing with flooding. And yet you have a small community able to find the resources to do it and to help themselves. And I think that's also a lesson that we need to pay particular attention to. Now in Colorado, flooding is a big hazard, and of course we just passed the 1-year anniversary of some of their most significant flooding in recent Colorado history. But wildfires are even a bigger hazard. And so what they've done at the state level is that they have developed a income tax rebate for doing wildfire hazard mitigation techniques. We know how to do this stuff. That's the thing that's interesting. Over the last several decades, we know the techniques to reduce risk. We know how to adapt. And yes, they're evolving and we're learning new things, but we know the basic measures are there. And in the state of Colorado now, for households that want to undertake hazard mitigation, there's up to a $2,500 tax rebate on their personal income tax. This summer in the state of Connecticut, they just stood up a low-interest loan program. So if you've especially focused on flood issues in particular, the National Flood Insurance Program is something that was certainly making news in the last 2 years or so, where Congress decided to reform it in 2012, and then they decided they didn't like the reforms in 2012. They were a little too harsh, so they re-reformed it in 2014, and now we're not exactly sure what we have. But what we do know is flood insurance rates are going up, and the state pitched in and said, you know what, we need to do something. We're going to provide yet another vehicle to enable adaptation, to enable resiliency, to enable hazard mitigation, so that homes and properties can be elevated or flood-proofed. So when we scale up resilience, it's kind of a peculiar phenomena when we talk about it at the national level. On one hand, at the national level, whether it be private sector or at the federal government level, you have the resources, the scope, and the convening power of large organizations, including the federal government, to impact resiliency. And of course, at the federal government level, they own a lot of facilities. But it's peculiar because implementation, especially the hazard mitigation type items, the defenses against flooding and wildfire and tornado and all of those things are being led locally. The power of land use, the power of building codes are local customerly driven. And so what we kind of see is this parallel track right now, where at the national level we're building tools and data and doing assessments and research, and there's leadership in that way, but at the local and state level, the implementation leadership is over here, and they're running parallel. And so we hope that there's a convergence of those, but keeping those constraints in mind, there are three main points I wanted to talk about in terms of, I think, talking about this at the national level. One of those is creating incentives or eliminating unintended consequences, specifically for the hazard of flooding, but I think with any of the natural hazards. When you talk to folks that have been working in the field a long time, they will say, look at your programs and policies, especially look at disaster assistance. We have some of the most generous disaster assistance policies in the world, and it absolutely encourages complacency. Even if the reality is that people don't get made whole as much as they think. It's the notion that gets reinforced every time we have the federal government or politicians come up and say, you know what, I'm going to get you assistance within 3 days and we're going to make everything okay. And disaster assistance actually is a disincentive to good resiliency and adaptation actions, especially the way it's structured today. The National Flood Insurance Program, of course, is one of those that because there is a subsidy built into the program, it disincents people from doing adaptation. And so this graphic is one of those informational graphics, at least in my world, that has been so useful, where we have to almost change the dialogue, and these are flood insurance rates. And the subsidized flood insurance rate for this particular house would be about $2,000 a year. And the subsidized, if your house is 4 feet below the 100-year flood elevation, then $9,500 a year, and if it's 3 feet above, it's about $427 a year. But the fact is, you have subsidized rates for old buildings, and so those buildings could be 4 feet, 10 feet below flood elevation, and they're getting a subsidized rate of $2,000 a year. Does that encourage adaptation and resiliency? Secondly, comprehensive research and data programs. We need basic research in doing these measures. And again, I said before, we do know a lot that we can do. My gosh, if we applied what we knew, we would be in so much of a better place than we are. But we also need basic data, especially in hazard identification. Did you know that in the United States, we've only mapped a third of the floodplains in this country? And only half of those stream miles in the U.S. have detailed flood data that are actionable. In the area of wildfire, we can't even agree on the method to identify that particular hazard. So there is a legitimate national federal role in providing this basic kind of data. There was a good format change in this last National Climate Assessment report, and I had participated on the Rural and Agricultural Community Work Group, and one of the format changes that was so useful is that this latest National Climate Assessment was really focused on getting actionable information into the hands of decision makers so that they could do something about it. And then finally, you know, any large organization, whether it's an NGO or the federal government, can facilitate information exchanges. It is amazing how quickly the technology and the knowledge and the science is really converging so that we can take actions even on that smallest local unit of government level. And then finally, federal leadership. Federal leadership is something that is a little bit in need these days. And you know, while this current administration, simply from the standpoint of what they've done in climate change, the executive order, especially 13653 on climate preparedness, they've done a lot of good things. But from the folks in the news media standpoint, I think the follow-up questions become very important. It's one thing to have an executive order out there that says you have to have adaptation plans, but how good are they? I mean, do they actually apply to all their programs? Have agencies and programs and their policies been changed? Maybe they haven't. I'll give you a good example. All the federal agencies are supposed to look at and change their programs to remove barriers to resiliency and adaptation, and to fund those kinds of programs and to resource those programs that promote these types of activities. And in the case of FEMA, there's a program called the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. And again, hazard mitigation equivalent to adaptation resiliency. And this same administration has proposed to zero it out for the last 3 years. So it's the follow-up questions. It's really digging beneath to make sure and hold the agencies accountable that they are actually embarking on this climate preparedness journey. And then interagency coordination. One of the things that will be coming out, again, in the flood world is that there's going to be, I think, a national flood rebuilding standard. This came out of Sandy. But you have an interagency task force actually working right now to come up with a national standard that might drive at least a lot of the federal government decisions, and that would be real leadership. So we're looking forward to that. And of course, just today, I think I got a text even before earlier this afternoon. I know Senator Baldwin in Wisconsin introduced the Digital Coast Act. And again, the Digital Coast Act, if you want to see a piece of legislation that is actually focused on resiliency, adaptation, and climate change, that is a piece of legislation that was just introduced today. So with that, I'd like to thank you. And if you ever need to talk flood and flood management issues, please know whether you want to talk to us at the national office. Each state has a floodplain management office, and so you can find those through our websites. Each state has a hazard mitigation office, and we also have the contacts there as well. Thank you very much.